This is Jim Bish with the Americans in Wartime Museum. Today's date is March 28, 2019, and I'm conducting an interview with Patricia Pat Herrmann.
Correct.
And in Sun City, Arizona. Pat, would you please give me your full name and where you were born?
Patricia Ann Herrmann. I was born in Urbana, Illinois.
And did you grow up in Illinois?
No, my father was stationed there. He was teaching military at the University of Illinois at the time I was born.
Okay. So it sounds like you were an Army brat growing up. Did you travel and live in a lot of different places?
I did.
Where were they?
Well, mostly in Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Okay.
Fort Riley, Kansas. Fort Bliss, Texas. Dad was in the cavalry. So those were cavalry, and then later it became armored.
Mm-hmm.
He was with the 3rd Armored, and when the war came, he put Mother and I in Florida, where we lived while he was in Indio, California, training for the European theater.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't go into the European theater until after the invasion.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time he was a general officer. He'd been in 20 years or so by then.
So he served in World War I and in World War II. And
He was enlisted in World War I, and after World War I he resigned and then re-enlisted with a commission.
Okay. And meanwhile, you traveled all around with him growing up. Your family
Yes.
did.
Traditional Army brat.
Yeah. So his influence must have aided you. How did you find? Where did you graduate from high school at?
I went to 5 high schools. Several in the Atlanta, Georgia area when we were at Fort McPherson.
Okay.
And then Dad was stationed in Manila. Oh, in between, Mother and I went to her home in Indiana, where I went to school there while Dad got quarters for us in Manila. Then we went to Manila. So I went to school in both Atlanta and Indiana, then Manila, and then I finished in San Jose, California after he retired.
Okay. So was he in Manila after World War II or before?
That was well after the war. We were there in 48 and 49.
Okay.
The Philippine Ryukas Command.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were there, we were fortunate enough to take what they called the milk run in those days, and Mother and I went by ship. We went through Honolulu and Guam, and went to the Philippines, and on our way home we went to Okinawa, Japan, and then back the same route.
Wow.
So, it was a wonderfully, what would you say, educating experience for a teenager.
Yeah. And I missed it. Where did you say you graduated from then?
San Jose High School.
So that was after you came back from Manila?
My last year and a half in high school were in San Jose.
Okay. And how did you find your way into military service?
Well, I went to San Jose State College, and my education was in occupational therapy. And in occupational therapy, you have 5 years of training. The 5th year out of college is called a clinical training. And in private life, you pay your way. And knowing the military, I volunteered to go into the Army, and they paid for my clinical training, and they signed me at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital.
Mm-hmm. That was a smart move.
Yeah, and I was commissioned. I was a lieutenant, and it was wonderful. Lived in nurses' quarters. We were shared a bathroom with a nurse, and we had very comfortable accommodations.
Did you know you were going to be stationed at Fitzsimmons, or
No,
was that out of your control where they were going to put you?
At graduation, I got my assignment.
Mm-hmm.
And most of my classmates, my clinical training classmates, many of them were from schools up in the Middle West, and they were all sent to Fort Sam Houston for basic training. I never had a basic training. I went straight from college to Fitzsimmons, which was, again, I have no idea why, but the first 9 months I did what clinical students did. We were assigned a rotation to the different departments in the hospital for our experience. And then when I finished my clinical training, then I stayed on and worked in the hospital.
Yeah. What year did you finish up with San Jose State? That you finished?
1954.
And that's when you were enlisted in the Army, and they sent you to Fitzsimmons right at the end of
That's
the
right.
Korean War.
So I finished my affiliations the following spring.
And did you spend, how many years did you spend at Fitzsimmons then?
I was only there about a year and a half because I had gotten married. And when Dick left, I left with him.
So at that point, you ended your service with the Army as well at that point?
Yes.
Did you continue in the medical field after you were married?
Well, I raised a family first. When the youngest of our 5 was very young, I started back to work and worked through the educations,
Yeah,
supplementing income for education.
yeah.
Beautiful thing about occupational therapy, it's a profession where you can choose your hours. I did a consulting. I worked in geriatrics and physical disabilities.
It is a little more flexible as far as even where you do your practicing.
Well, right. I mean,
A lot of people go into homes and things like
about
that.
OT is you pick your area of specialty. You can go into physical disabilities, you can go into education, you can go into geriatrics.
Yeah.
And I worked primarily in geriatrics.
Did when you were doing your training at Fitzsimmons Medical Hospital, were you trained in all different areas then, or did you focus
Yes.
on one
Yes.
aspect?
Yeah, physical disabilities, psychiatry. You know, they rotated you through the different.
Is there any that you particularly did not like as you look
Well,
back?
I
Where you ended up?
would say that I was least drawn to psychiatry. I guess because the type of mental illness that was exhibited among the people at Fitzsimmons, I think they were very acute. You know, we saw very serious illnesses. And as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, you know, it's not as easy to do. Even though I had done work in psychiatry and while I was in school, it was not my favorite.
Were those coming from veterans that had been in combat zone areas? that
Well,
were
I'm
coming
sure there
back
was a
with-
lot of PSTD, you know, and the kind of reactions that some people have in their experience, you know.
Yeah.
It
You-
just is, it is the way it is.
Yeah. You mentioned that there was also a lot of lung disorders. You went through that
Well,
part as well.
The just as good Fort Sam was really focused largely on physical disabilities, and of course Walter Reed has always been a very rehab focused facility, while Fitzsimmons focused on the lung diseases. So we got all the veterans who came back or who had family that came back with lung disease. And so we were working with those. We taught a lot of guys how to knit. You know, they're
Keep their
they
hands and minds occupied.
keep them occupied and feeling useful and productive.
Were
Not everybody wants to do printing or
Right.
other things, you know. You have to give them things to keep them gainfully
yeah.
engaged.
Yes. Did besides tuberculosis and polio, Were there just
Oh.
injuries and all
Oh,
kinds
yes.
of variety of lung
Yes.
problems you saw?
They would send us the people who were local more to that region. You know, the people that could get to homes more reasonably
Yeah.
from that area.
So a lot of the western and up in western,
Yeah.
midwestern areas you service
Well, of
families.
course, there was one in, Letterman was the other general hospital in California.
Okay.
And Tripler and Hawaii.
Did you deal with any cancers, like lung cancer or anything like that, or was that another facility that dealt mostly with
Well,
things like that?
we saw most of all kinds of disease, you know, as you will in a general hospital.
I know that, speaking of lungs, a lot of the mess kits and everything had cigarettes in them. Did you witness any smoking-related issues with lung
Well,
problems?
I'm sure they were complicated by that.
Yeah,
You know, people in, we always, people in oxygen tents, you know, and wanting to smoke,
yeah,
which is not an ideal thing.
no. And that time period, smoking was glamorized. Almost everybody seemed to be doing it, you know, in the 50s.
It was not deemed a problem until much later.
Right, yeah. So your career, after you came back into the workforce, when did you start working again, and when did you finally retire?
As I say, I started when my youngest was a baby, and he was born in '66, so I probably went back to work around '67. And then I worked until we retired in '92.
Okay. Getting back to the military side of it, it appears that you had a little bit more knowledge of the military because of your upbringing, and you realized they could pay for some of your training instead of going out and just trying to do it yourself. What other impact did having growing up in a military family? Is there anything that you noticed or that you realized later on that you had some benefits by being aware of growing up in a military family?
I think that military people have a great deal of flexibility because you learn to adapt. Someone who grows up in the same location and with the same friends all their lives doesn't have to learn to cope like a military youngster does. And you come to learn that there are good people everywhere. And you just pick up and start over and find friends, people who have things in common with you, and it works fine.
Yes. Did any of your own children go into the military?
No, they did not. They all worshiped their grandfather, but none of them, well, it was the time when they grew up too.
Yeah, that's part of it. Different times.
They were really not growing up in years when it was urgent or imperative to be in the military.
Yeah.
And so it just never became an issue for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And none of my grandchildren have either. And I was 17.
Congratulations. That's good. Is there anything about your military service at Fitzsimmons that you would, you know, anything that you'd say, any patients that came through that you remember or that as highlights during that time frame, or unusual cases that came through?
No, I can't say that there was anything outstanding. I guess I was focused on trying to do a good job
Yeah.
and to help them what best I could.
Yeah. Sounds like a good medical person.
Well,
Thank you very much for your interview.
Thank
and
you.
thank you for your time at Fitzsimmons.